All right, so you got some sample packs, you got a little bit of synthesis knowledge, a little bit of arrangement knowledge. The next step is, how do I build a theme for a track and what goes into that? This is probably the most important thing that you want to consider when trying to actually create a song, because what is your song going to be about? It's almost like coming up with a story, right? Three Little Pigs. Do I want this story to be tragic? Do I want it to be happy? Do I want it to be sad? All that other stuff. That's all fine, and those are definitely things to consider, but I actually kind of want to talk about the practicality approach to what your mind usually goes to whenever you start with different things. So ideally, when we talk about a theme for a track, it's basically, what is the anchor of what everything else is surrounded by. It could be a bass line, it could be a rhythm or a groove, it could be a melody, it could be a combination of stuff, it could be a particular call and response. Maybe you hear the birds chirping outside and then you want to have some violin to it and have a dynamic relationship of that. This all goes into really just certain phrases that you find interesting, to be totally transparent. So the thing that I want to talk about today, though, is not necessarily how to do that from each angle, but really the importance of knowing that whenever you pick a theme, your brain starts to problem solve around that theme. So for example, if I spend all of my time trying to develop some drums, which I made some yesterday, so I'll just pull up that if I can find it. Cool, first one, let's go. So let's say I spend all my time making some drums kind of like this. Well, what's the first thing that comes after this, right? Or what else am I going to be doing? Or what am I going to be thinking about? What's the next decision? Finding something that goes with these drums, right? So likewise, if I have a chord progression or I have a melody or something, and I've talked about this many times, the stuff that you start with, generally speaking, what you start with is what you start building your themes around. Unless if you have some training in composition, and unless if you spend an entire day doing sound design or something, and then you start to try to just throw stuff at the wall. That would be the one exception that I'll talk about in a few minutes. But for somebody like me that doesn't necessarily have a direction or a sense of like, oh, what do I want to make my track about? I'm just going from pure spontaneity. A lot of times what you start with is what you try to make everything else build around. So keeping that in mind, sometimes it could be helpful to kind of just dip your toes in doing a little bit of each. So for example, if I have something that might not be a fully fleshed out pattern, but I start with something kind of like a hi-hat, maybe one that's kind of a little better. No. Okay, these are mine. So let's say I just want to start with something kind of like this. And I want to start with what I was talking about earlier, like building a groove. But I don't flesh out the groove so hard that it doesn't have space for anything else. I'm going to make this twice as fast. Sorry, sometimes I like to just listen to that stuff and just start to either audiate like we've talked about in the other videos, or I like to just sit down and pretend or imagine what else could be going over this, right? Starting with a single tone, starting with, a bass phrase, or maybe you've got a mud pie of different basses and stuff. I think that I've got some bass chops around here. Bass fills, basses, and music. There we go. So if I've got something random here, and forgive me if I'm not doing sound design from scratch like I usually do, but this would take a lot longer. Instead of me being like, oh, whatever, random, maybe I can just start with an empty clip and think about the placement of this. So instead of it being like, all right, and trying to think of the whole thing, I can start to try to think about just creating one simple response to. So maybe right here we replace this with something else. Maybe we do this on every other one. And again, I'm not trying to build a track, but I'm trying to show you like how I just thought of what can go after this and what can go next, right? And so by starting with drums, I'm looking at different ways to create complements to whatever it is that we're working on. If we scratch this and we talk about melodic relationships, right? Say I've got, I'm going to do this very quickly, but say I've got some kind of melodic thing or some kind of chord progression. So if I pull up scalar and we do something very simple, we can leave this in piano, to be honest, and then I can grab some user things and go to something like this. I've pulled this up before. These are just some chords that I like. We can actually grab this from rolling sampler and turn this up, loop it. And we can grab something like beam, and I've shown you how to do this before, so we're just going to kind of speed run this onto something else. Cool. So let's say we've got a very simple idea here, and we're going to start with making this into something that is kind of like a loop or a hook, right? So we can actually take something kind of like this and maybe think about maybe grabbing this as a response. So now we go something like this, and now we're thinking about melody and harmony. It's actually not bad. Maybe we can go so now let's say we have a hook or whatever, you know, just for the sake of context. Well, what do we do from this? Well, with this rhythm, right, we start thinking about, well, what can go on top of this? What can we add to complement that? And so some people might be starting to think about doing some kind of bass line or something. Say we just grab very quickly an 808. I find that it's more efficient for me to do this stuff from scratch than to try to search for things sometimes, so forgive me if I'm just like busting through this. But if we grab a filter, we go like that, we turn this down, we do this, we grab a limiter, and we got a nice little 808. So I don't know what key this is in. I think F works. It's in C. So within this, we can do something very basic like what we just did. So we can just go and then the next thing that we start thinking about is getting our, you know, something kind of like so. So if I have something kind of the sort here, maybe I actually have a drum loop and I want to cut it up. So let's say I want to figure out one of these claps or something. But maybe I don't want it to be so something like the sort. Well, what I can do is I can put this on here and start layering this, or, you know, whatever, or just replace it. I like making my claps early sometimes. But you see how I'm starting to build everything around this hook. I'm starting to build something around this starting point, around this idea. And I want this to kind of be aware for newer producers in particular, and maybe people that are getting stuck about things, because what is your objective when it comes into making beats? And notice I said beats, because we're not talking about orchestrating music. We're not talking about scoring a film. We're not talking about making ambient or whatever. We're talking about making beats. And if it's a techno beat, if it's a halftime beat, if it's a drum and bass beat, anything that comes together kind of like this, we call it cooking it up, right? This all kind of has a similar playing field about how we go about creating ideas for tracks. But the thing is once we have something like this, sorry, I was wanting to add some variation to that. So what if we did something like... Now we've got a groove. We have a bass line. We have everything that we pretty much need in order to create, you know, an idea out of this. And this is how simple music can be. And if you're working with loops and you get really comfortable with cutting loops up and just seeing samples, I think, or seeing sounds outside of what they just present themselves to be, which is another video that I've talked about, which is the most important... the most important skill that I've learned in music production, which is the idea of being resourceful, hearing things out of context. But now that we have something that we can sit on and we have this 1-bar loop, we can literally make an entire song about this. And it can scale, right? And we can have different ideas about progressions and stuff, which I'll show you here in a second. But where you start generally is where things take you. And I think that this is important to talk about in the first place, because this is your gateway to workflow. This is also your gateway to understanding the mindset behind what it is that you're trying to go into. So take this for example. Let's say I wanted to write a drum and bass track, you know, and we'll start with bass. I'm just going to grab one that I think is going to sound kind of cool, if that's all right with you all. But I'm going to go into day 26, which I made during my 30-day drum and bass challenge. I have this available on my website at alckemy.com if you want this exact one, but it makes sounds kind of like this. So what I can do with something like this is we can kind of bounce out. I'm going to add a fuse compressor to this just because it has a tendency to make things sound very pleasant to me. But cool. So now that we have a bunch of stuff like that, let's say we start with basses. You know, we pull this out, we get to the cutting board, and we start thinking about adding phrases to this that we can use in order to build a bass line. So I'm just going to start with something that jumps out to me. Okay, so with this, I'm just going to put this right here and use this as our downbeat. So, and then we can start to think about or audiate or something, or even just place certain pieces of this particular thing that we're going to create a pattern to. So Even something as simple as this. What happened? So now coming into rhythm, boom, dum, 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 boom, dum, dum, dum. So we can start to find stuff like this that maybe will allow us to create a different hit or a different phrase. And this is why I think that I've done this before in how to build neurofunk drops and stuff, but coming up with something like this and having something here to that needs to be here. Something kind of like that. I mean, this is the starting point about how we get into, or a starting point anyways, of how you can get into, you know, making drum and bass lines. Now, that's not my favorite, but I'm trying to find if there's anything percussive, maybe. Actually, that's nice because that's a fundamental, so maybe we can do another hit right here somewhere. See if we pitch that up. And then we can have something right there that duplicates this and has something that we can kind of get into. So you might be saying, okay, well, now what? Well, now we have this phrase that is just a one-bar loop, and we start thinking about a couple of things. Now, because we started with a bass phrase, do we want to add drums? Do we want to add a melody? Do we want to maybe throw this whole thing into a resample chain and throw something like beam onto it and start getting different textures, which is generally what I do to kind of start fleshing this out. Because this thing isn't all that impressive. It's not, you know, the most groundbreaking thing ever, but getting into something that might give you a means of resampling, right? Which is another thing that I forgot to mention, of resampling. Of, you know, you start with something and then you start being like, well, does it need more? Does it need less? And now do I need to start thinking about other elements? Right? So even just something like that, which sounds pretty cool, there's this little thing in here that was like this little, you know, so now we've kind of added something in here that we can fit in between some of these places as a contrasting element. So maybe something right here. You know, or maybe what we want to do is we want to start thinking about something different to where we actually duplicate this and we create a different phrase. So we can start changing stuff around here. You know, that's kind of cool. We do want to have maybe establish like the first call. So you know, or we go something like that. We could do something here to where we change this. But you can see that from this we started creating different bases, or sorry, we created a baseline, but this goes into teaching you how to start thinking about tracks that are bass related. You know, you can do the same thing with dubstep, you can do the same thing with all this stuff, but we started from a few different things here, whether it be through melody or through drums or through this. But I think that it's important to realize, like, what is it that you're going for, and looking at different strategies to try to tackle that genre, but also to try to tackle building a theme in the first place. I will say that the more that you focus on thinking about this outside of the DAW, the more that it's going to help you build intention inside of the DAW and be like, okay, I'm going to go for something. And of course, you need to develop some ideas of how to just generate something from nothing, whether that be learning how to play, learning how to sound design in a means that will be a generative aspect, or learning how to be really creative with sample manipulation. But this all kind of goes in hand with playing, like I said before, into things like workflow. It goes in hand with different strategies that you can use at any time when you feel like you might be stuck, or when you feel like you can't do something. And I will say that the more that you can simplify, you know, the more that you can just play a stupid simple melody, make songs about those very basic ideas. There's nothing wrong with that. You know, how many songs do you know where the entire bass line is just one note? But it's how you build a relationship between all of those different sounds that is the difference between something sounding really boring or cheesy versus something that sounds compelling. And the more awareness that you have building into that, the more that it's not only going to make your themes more diverse, but it's also going to really help you understand what to look for whenever you're trying to find something to build a relationship to. So hopefully that makes sense. I hope that this isn't too obscure or too complicated. I know that I spent a lot of time doing this, but this generally takes a long time to put together. But yeah, when you're coming into these different ideas, give yourself that time, have patience, have fun with it, and just try to explore through what it is that you're doing. And don't begrudge the process, I guess. But hopefully that gives you some insight into how to build themes and how to strategize whenever you toss something in here. And yeah, let me know if you have any questions. Thanks, everybody. I will see you in the next one.